The cadaver dog alerted at precisely 3:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. It had been searching the backyard of 1427 Maple Street for less than 5 minutes when it suddenly stopped, nose pointed toward a raised garden bed that looked like every other raised bed in the quiet suburban neighborhood. The handler, Detective Carla Nash, had seen this behavior before. What made this different was what happened next. The dog didn't just alert, it refused to leave the spot. It circled the 8-foot-long, 3-foot-wide wooden frame filled with blooming tomato plants and fresh soil, then sat down definitively. The universal signal for human remains. The house belonged to Robert and Diane Harrison, a couple in their late 50s who'd lived there for 12 years. They'd built the raised garden bed themselves, neighbors said, about 6 months earlier. They'd been proud of it, showing off the vegetables they grew to anyone who walked by, but the dog was telling a different story. Beneath those tomato plants, beneath the fresh soil and mulch, beneath the carefully cultivated image of suburban domesticity, something else was growing. Something that had been buried deep enough to avoid detection, but not deep enough to evade a trained nose. Detective Nash marked the spot with orange spray paint and called for the forensic team. The excavation would take 8 hours, proceeding layer by layer, inch by careful inch. Each shovelful of dirt would be sifted, examined, cataloged. The process was methodical, scientific, exacting. At 11:23 p.m., nearly 8 hours after the dog first alerted, the team found what they were looking for. It wasn't a complete body, that would have been too simple. Instead, they found bones. Human bones, specifically a left femur, a pelvic bone, and several vertebrae, arranged in a pattern that suggested deliberate burial rather than random disposal. The medical examiner would later confirm what the dog already knew. These remains had been buried for at least 6 months, possibly longer. They belonged to an adult male, approximately 6 feet tall, who had died from trauma to the skull. The garden had been hiding a murder victim, and the Harrisons had been tending their vegetables over a grave. Maple Heights was the kind of suburban community where nothing happened, the kind of place where neighbors brought casseroles when someone was sick, where children played in the streets until dusk, where the biggest controversy was whether to install speed bumps on Maple Street. Robert and Diane Harrison fit the neighborhood perfectly. Robert managed the local hardware store, a job he'd held for 15 years. Diane worked part-time at the library and served on the neighborhood watch committee. They attended church every Sunday, volunteered at the food bank monthly, and hosted an annual 4th of July barbecue that was the social event of the season. Their house at 1427 Maple Street was a modest 3-bedroom colonial, painted yellow with white trim, surrounded by a meticulously maintained lawn. They'd bought it in 2011, moving from a smaller house 2 blocks away when Robert got his promotion. The backyard was their pride and joy, professionally landscaped with a stone patio, custom-built raised garden beds, and a koi pond that Robert had installed himself. The neighborhood had watched the transformation with approval. The Harrisons weren't just good neighbors. They were the kind of people who made everyone else feel better about their own life choices. They represented stability, tradition, the American dream realized in vinyl siding and annual flowers. But suburban facades can be deceiving. Behind closed doors, in the privacy of well-maintained homes, people harbor secrets that would shock their neighbors. The Harrisons' secret just happened to be buried in their backyard, 6 feet beneath the tomato plants. The investigation began with a missing person report filed on March 15, 2023. Michael Brennan, a 34-year-old accountant, had vanished from his downtown office 6 days earlier. His car was found in the parking garage, his phone and wallet left on his desk. Security footage showed him leaving the building at 5:47 p.m. on March 9th, but he never made it home. Michael's wife, Jennifer, reported him missing when he failed to pick up their daughter from daycare. She told detectives they'd been having marital problems. Michael had recently discovered her affair with a co-worker and had threatened divorce. Jennifer admitted the affair but denied any knowledge of Michael's disappearance. The initial investigation focused on the marriage. Detectives interviewed Jennifer's lover, examined the couple's finances, and searched the Brennan house. They found Michael's packed suitcase in the bedroom closet, suggesting he'd been planning to leave. His passport was missing, leading to theories that he'd simply walked away from his life. But Michael's family insisted he would never abandon his daughter. His credit cards hadn't been used. His bank accounts were untouched. His phone, left on his desk, contained no calls or texts after 5:42 p.m. on March 9th. He had vanished without a trace. The case went cold for 3 months. Michael's photo was circulated. His description entered into national databases. His face appeared on missing person posters throughout the city. Tips were called in, investigated, and dismissed. The trail was non-existent. Then came the anonymous letter, handwritten on plain white paper, postmarked from a downtown mailbox delivered to police headquarters on June 3rd. It contained one sentence. Check the garden at 1427 Maple Street. You'll find what you're looking for. The letter was signed with a single initial, J. Detective Nash had been assigned to Michael Brennan's case after the original detective retired. She'd reviewed the file repeatedly, searching for missed connections, overlooked evidence, alternative theories. The anonymous letter provided the first concrete lead in months. She approached the Harrisons' house cautiously, using the pretext of a routine missing person follow-up. Diane answered the door, smiling pleasantly, inviting the detective inside. Robert was at work, she explained, but she'd be happy to help in any way she could. The house was immaculate. Family photos lined the walls, religious artwork decorated the halls, fresh flowers sat on every table. It was the home of people who valued appearance, who understood the importance of making a good impression. Detective Nash asked about Michael Brennan. Diane claimed she'd never met him, didn't recognize his photo, had no knowledge of his disappearance. She seemed genuinely puzzled by the detective's questions, even sympathetic to the family's plight. When Nash asked about the backyard, Diane's demeanor shifted subtly. She became more guarded, more formal. Yes, they'd built raised garden beds. Yes, they'd been growing vegetables. Yes, she'd be happy to show the detective around. The backyard was beautiful. Perfectly manicured lawn, carefully tended flower beds, the elaborate koi pond Robert had built. The raised garden beds were impressive, professionally constructed, filled with rich soil, planted with tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. Detective Nash noted everything: the freshness of the soil, the placement of the raised beds, the way one bed sat slightly higher than the others, the fact that tomato plants, normally spaced 2 feet apart, were planted closer together over one particular section. She thanked Diane for her time and left. But she didn't go far. She returned with the cadaver dog 2 days later, having obtained a warrant based on the anonymous letter and her observations. The dog alerted immediately, just as it had that first day. The forensic team arrived within hours, setting up a grid system, beginning the careful excavation that would consume the next 8 hours. They found Michael Brennan's remains exactly where the dog indicated, beneath the raised garden bed in the Harrisons' backyard, buried 6 feet deep, covered with layers of soil, compost, and growing vegetables. The body had been dismembered, the parts arranged to minimize space, the bones showing signs of having been burned before burial. It was the most methodical, calculated burial Detective Nash had encountered in her 12 years investigating homicides. The forensic excavation proceeded with scientific precision. Each layer of soil was removed separately, photographed, and cataloged. The depth of the grave, 6 feet, suggested planning and physical effort. The dismemberment indicated knowledge of anatomy and disposal techniques. The burning showed an attempt to destroy evidence. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the medical examiner, supervised the recovery personally. She noted that the dismemberment had been done with precision. Joints separated at natural connections, bones cut cleanly rather than broken. This suggested either medical knowledge or research into anatomical structure. The burning had been partial. Flesh destroyed, but bone structure remaining. This indicated an attempt to eliminate identifying features rather than complete destruction. The perpetrator had been careful but not professional. Most disturbing was the arrangement of the remains. The body parts had been positioned methodically, almost respectfully, as if the killer wanted to minimize the victim's discomfort in death. It was simultaneously callous and considerate, a dichotomy that would haunt the investigation. The soil analysis provided additional information. The grave had been dug recently, within the past 6 months, based on the condition of the soil layers and the growth patterns of plant roots. The raised garden bed had been constructed afterward, specifically to conceal the grave. The tomatoes growing above it were mature plants, suggesting they'd been transplanted rather than grown from seed. Trace evidence was minimal but telling. A single metal button, not belonging to Michael Brennan's clothing, was found mixed with the remains. It appeared to be from a work shirt, possibly blue-collar attire. The button showed signs of having been in the ground for months, its metal tarnished and fabric backing partially decomposed. DNA analysis confirmed the remains were Michael Brennan's within 48 hours. The forensic odontologist matched dental records exactly. The DNA profile matched samples from Michael's parents, who provided comparison material when identification became necessary. The cause of death was established as blunt force trauma to the head, followed by dismemberment and burning. The trauma pattern suggested a heavy object, possibly a hammer or similar tool. The number of blows, at least 6, indicated rage or determination, rather than professional efficiency. The time frame of death was established as March 9, 2023, the day Michael disappeared, based on stomach contents that showed partially digested food consistent with lunch eaten that day. The body had been buried within hours of death before decomposition could begin. While the forensic team worked, other investigators searched the Harrisons' property. A metal detector located several areas of interest in the backyard. One contained the remains of burned clothing, jeans, and a shirt that matched Michael's description. Another held a collection of tools, including a hammer whose head matched the trauma pattern on Michael's skull. Most damning was the discovery of a second grave. Not complete like the first, but begun. A shallow depression marked with surveying flags, suggesting the killer had planned additional burials. It was located beneath what would have been the next raised garden bed in the Harrisons' expansion plan. The evidence painted a clear picture. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. It was a systematic plan to eliminate Michael Brennan and conceal his death permanently. The level of preparation suggested either extensive research or previous experience. Detective Nash expanded the investigation. She re-examined other missing person cases in the area, looking for patterns, connections, similar circumstances. She found 3 cases that shared characteristics: middle-aged men, marital problems, last seen leaving work, bodies never recovered. All 3 had lived within a 5-mile radius of the Harrisons. All 3 had disappeared within the past 5 years. All 3 had been reported missing by spouses or partners who'd since moved away or remarried. The implications were staggering. If the Harrisons were responsible for multiple murders, they represented a serial killing. Partnership. A phenomenon rare enough to be remarkable, but dangerous. Enough to require immediate attention, but proving multiple murders would require more than circumstantial connections. It would require bodies, evidence, and testimony. It would require the Harrisons to make a mistake, to reveal their methods, to expose their secrets. It would require Detective Nash to dig deeper, literally and figuratively, than she'd ever dug before. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Diane Harrison's journal. Found during a search of the house, it wasn't hidden or encrypted. It was sitting on her nightstand, written in careful cursive handwriting, detailing the past 5 years of her life in meticulous detail. The first entries were mundane: garden plans, church activities, recipes. But as the investigation progressed, the entries became more revealing. Diane wrote about dreams of violence, fantasies of control, detailed observations of neighbors and their routines. She described herself as invisible, overlooked, powerless. Then came the entry from March 10, 2023, the day after Michael's disappearance. Robert did it. I helped. We planned it for months. He deserved it. They all deserve it. The garden is finally useful. The admission was startling in its casualness. Diane wrote about the murder as if describing a dinner party or gardening project. Something routine, necessary, even satisfying. She provided details that matched the forensic evidence exactly: the time of death, the method of killing, the disposal of the body, the construction of the raised bed. But Diane's journal revealed something else. She wasn't a willing accomplice. She was a victim herself, controlled, manipulated, threatened by Robert into participating. She'd written about his violent temper, his detailed plans, his fascination with anatomy and dismemberment. She'd tried to leave him twice, but he'd threatened to kill her family if she did. More disturbing were entries suggesting Michael Brennan wasn't the first. Diane wrote about the others as if they were garden projects. Different varieties planted in different locations, each with their own story and characteristics. She referenced specific dates, names, and locations that matched the missing person cases Detective Nash had identified. The journal described a system. Robert would identify men in vulnerable situations, those with marital problems, financial difficulties, few close relationships. He'd befriend them, learn their routines, understand their struggles. Then he'd offer solutions, divorce advice, financial guidance, personal counseling, whatever might help. When the time was right, he'd invite them to the house, sometimes for drinks, sometimes for dinner, sometimes for a business opportunity that never materialized. The invitation always came on a Wednesday, the one day Diane had her book club and Robert had the house to himself. Except Diane's book club had been canceled for 2 months due to renovation at the library. She'd been home for every single murder. She'd heard the conversations, the arguments, the final moments. She'd helped clean up afterward, dispose of evidence, and build the garden beds that would conceal the evidence forever. Diane's journal became a confession, a witness statement, and a victim impact statement all in one. It detailed 15 murders over 5 years. 15 men who'd disappeared without explanation, their bodies buried in backyards throughout the community, their deaths masked by the most mundane suburban activities: gardening, home improvement, neighborhood watch meetings. The most chilling revelation came from the final entry, dated the day before the search warrant was served. The police are getting closer. Robert knows it's ending. He says we have one more to plant before we retire. I think he means me. I've written everything down. Maybe this will help the families find peace. Maybe it will help me find peace, too. Diane had documented her own death before it happened. She'd predicted Robert's final act with the clarity of someone who'd witnessed his methods repeatedly. She'd left a record not just of crimes, but of a systematic predator who'd turned suburbia into his personal killing ground. The implications were staggering. The Harrisons weren't just killers. They were serial predators who'd operated undetected for years. They'd used the trappings of suburban respectability to mask systematic murder, turning community involvement into opportunity, neighborhood trust into access, gardening expertise into evidence destruction. Diane's journal didn't just break the case, it revealed a conspiracy that spanned years, involved dozens of accomplices unknowingly, and came chillingly close to remaining undiscovered forever. The garden wasn't just hiding one body, it was hiding a complete history of suburban predation, documented by someone who'd participated reluctantly but observed meticulously. Detective Nash faced an unprecedented task: identifying 15 victims, locating 15 graves, proving 15 murders based on one woman's detailed confession. The garden had revealed its secret, but it was just the beginning of a much larger, much darker story. The trial of Robert Harrison began on March 15, 2024, exactly 1 year after Michael Brennan's disappearance. The prosecution faced an unprecedented challenge: proving 15 murders based primarily on the testimony of an accomplice who was also a victim, with physical evidence for only one body. District Attorney Richard Phillips constructed his case methodically. He began with Michael Brennan's murder, physical evidence, forensic proof, undeniable connection to the Harrisons' property. He established Robert's pattern of behavior, his systematic approach to victim selection, his use of suburban respectability as camouflage. The prosecution presented Diane Harrison as their star witness. She'd survived Robert's final attack. He'd tried to kill her the night before their arrest, but she'd escaped and hidden in a neighbor's garage. Her testimony was devastating, detailed, precise, emotionally raw. She described each murder with the specificity of someone who'd witnessed systematic evil in action. The defense, led by prominent attorney Victor Hastings, faced an impossible task. Robert Harrison was charged with 15 counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and multiple counts of fraud. The evidence, while primarily circumstantial, was overwhelming in scope and detail. Hastings's strategy was aggressive but limited. He attacked Diane's credibility, suggesting she'd been an unwilling participant who'd only turned on Robert when faced with prosecution. He questioned her memory, her motivations, her emotional stability. He suggested the journal was fiction, elaborate fantasies written by a disturbed woman seeking attention. But Diane's testimony was supported by physical evidence. The single body provided forensic confirmation of her methods. Financial records showed systematic fraud against victims. Phone records documented communications between Robert and the missing men. The pattern she'd described matched every piece of evidence investigators had uncovered. The prosecution's case extended beyond individual murders. They presented evidence of a systematic predation scheme. Robert Harrison's identification of vulnerable men, his cultivation of their trust, his manipulation of their circumstances to facilitate murder. It was serial killing as business model, murder as community service. The defense called character witnesses who described Robert as a helpful neighbor, dedicated volunteer, supportive friend. They presented him as a victim of circumstance. Married to a disturbed woman who'd fabricated elaborate fantasies to explain her own criminal behavior. They suggested the missing men had simply disappeared, moved away, started new lives. But the jury saw through the characterization. The evidence was too specific, too detailed, too comprehensive to be fantasy. Diane's journal contained information only someone who'd witnessed the crimes could know. The physical evidence confirmed her descriptions of methods, locations, and aftermath. The prosecution faced one major challenge: Diane's criminal liability. As an accomplice to multiple murders, she faced potential life sentences herself. Her cooperation was essential but problematic. She was simultaneously witness, victim, and perpetrator. The solution was unprecedented. Diane pleaded guilty to reduced charges, obstruction of justice, and evidence tampering in exchange for her testimony against Robert. She received a 15-year sentence, ensuring she'd spend significant time in prison while acknowledging her role in the crimes. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Their questions revealed their focus. They wanted to understand how systematic predation could operate undetected for years, how community trust could be perverted so completely, how suburban normalcy could mask systematic murder. The verdict was unanimous: guilty on all counts. Robert Harrison received 15 consecutive life sentences plus 150 years. The judge's comments were scathing. "You corrupted everything you touched. You turned community service into systematic murder. You used suburban respectability as camouflage for evil." The Harrison case concluded in June 2024, but its implications continue reverberating through communities nationwide. The discovery of Michael Brennan's body led to the identification of 14 other victims, each buried in suburban backyards, each concealed beneath the trappings of normal domestic life. The case established precedents for accomplice testimony, systematic predation charges, and evidence interpretation in serial murder cases. It also highlighted the vulnerability of suburban communities to predators who understand and exploit social trust, neighborhood dynamics, and community involvement patterns. But beyond legal technicalities, the Harrison case reveals something more disturbing about contemporary society. The Harrisons weren't social outcasts. They were community leaders, neighborhood volunteers, church attendees. They represented the ideals suburban communities aspire to, while systematically destroying the lives of vulnerable neighbors. The garden where Michael Brennan was found became a memorial, then a park, then finally a foundation supporting families of missing persons. The transformation was community-driven, an attempt to reclaim space corrupted by evil and transform it into something positive. Diane Harrison's testimony and journal revealed not just crimes, but the systematic perversion of normalcy. She documented how Robert had studied neighborhood patterns, learned community dynamics, identified social vulnerabilities. He'd understood that the most effective camouflage wasn't isolation, but involvement. Not rejection, but acceptance. The documentary closes with Detective Nash's final reflection. We trust our neighbors because we have to. Society can't function without basic trust, but sometimes that trust is betrayed in ways that are calculated, systematic, and evil. The garden didn't just hide bodies. It hid a complete corruption of everything suburban communities believe in. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who live next door, who attend your church, who help with your charity drives. Sometimes evil wears the face of normalcy. The case serves as a reminder that appearances deceive, trust can be weaponized, and sometimes the most horrifying secrets are buried not in remote wilderness but in suburban backyards, hidden beneath tomato plants and mulch, concealed by the people who seem most trustworthy.